On the afternoon of March 23, 1992, an elderly man stepped through the doors of the British Embassy in Riga, Latvia. He was carrying two battered suitcases. They were not heavy enough to attract attention. They looked like the kind of luggage owned by someone who had traveled many times and replaced them rarely. He did not look like a man about to change intelligence history. He was 69 years old, average height, thinning gray hair, a dark, worn coat that blended into the late winter streets of Riga. Nothing about his appearance suggested urgency, danger, or importance. He approached the security desk calmly and made a simple request. He asked to speak with someone from British intelligence. At Western embassies across the former Soviet bloc, this kind of request was not unusual in early 1992. The Soviet Union had collapsed only months earlier. Borders were unstable. Institutions were dissolving. Embassies were flooded with walk-ins claiming to have secret information. Most of them were ignored. Some were opportunists looking for money or visas. Some were confused former officials hoping to trade rumors for protection. Others were deliberate provocations sent by intelligence services testing Western responses. An elderly Russian man with two old suitcases fit none of the profiles that triggered urgency. The guard did what protocol required. He asked the man to wait. When the embassy's security officer arrived, the interview began cautiously. The man spoke slowly, in clear but accented English. He introduced himself as Vasili Mitrokhin, a former officer of the Soviet Committee for State Security. He explained that he had worked for the KGB for more than 30 years. He said he had retired 2 years earlier. And then he made a claim so large that it sounded implausible even by the standards of that chaotic period. He said that for more than a decade, he had secretly copied the internal records of Soviet foreign intelligence. Not a handful of files, not selected documents, but thousands of pages describing espionage operations across dozens of countries. The officer listening to him had heard similar claims before. Usually they collapsed within minutes under basic questioning. People exaggerated their access, they misunderstood what they had seen, or they invented stories entirely. Mitrokhin did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He did not ask for anything. He simply said that the material existed, that it was hidden in Russia, and that he believed it should not remain buried. The conversation stretched on. Hours passed. The embassy corridor outside the interview room grew quiet as evening approached. What made the officer hesitate before dismissing the man was not the scale of his claim. It was the way he spoke about it.
Mitrokhin did not describe himself as a hero. He did not describe betrayal as bravery. He did not speak with anger or excitement. He spoke like an archivist. When asked how he had copied the files, he did not say everything. He explained limits. He explained gaps. He explained what he could not access as clearly as what he could. When asked about specific KGB operations that British intelligence already knew about, he provided details that matched known facts, but also added information that had never been confirmed. Dates, code names, procedures, details that would have been extraordinarily difficult to fabricate. At a certain point, he opened one of his suitcases. Inside were handwritten pages, not originals, not official documents, but careful notes, organized and precise. They contained references to real operations that British intelligence had detected but never fully understood, operations that had left traces but no clear explanations. The officer did not react outwardly. Training demanded skepticism, but internally the calculation had begun to change. If this man was lying, he was lying with remarkable discipline. If he was telling the truth, the implications were enormous. The interview ended late that evening. Mitrokhin was told to return the next day. That night, a coded message was sent to London. It did not claim certainty. It did not promise a breakthrough. It reported contact with a possible defector whose information required serious evaluation. The response from headquarters was measured but clear. Proceed carefully. Verify everything. Over the following days, the questioning intensified. Mitrokhin was asked to describe buildings he should not have remembered, rooms he should not have entered, filing systems that only insiders would understand. He answered without hesitation. He described corridors, checkpoints, reading rooms. He explained how files were logged, how they were cross-referenced, how older operations were stored alongside newer ones. His knowledge was not theatrical. It was bureaucratic. That was what made it convincing. A man inventing espionage stories tends to focus on action, on meetings, on danger, on drama. Mitrokhin focused on paperwork. By the end of the week, the embassy assessment had changed again. This was no longer treated as a curiosity. It was treated as a risk. If his claims were true, then somewhere inside Russia existed an archive capable of exposing Soviet intelligence operations across 5 decades. An archive copied not by a field officer, but by someone who had handled the system's memory itself.
But there was still a fundamental problem. The notes he had brought were only samples, fragments, proof of concept. The real archive, he said, was hidden in his dacha outside Moscow, under floorboards, behind walls, buried in the ground. Retrieving it would mean sending him back into a country where former KGB officers were still monitored, where security services were reorganizing but not disappearing, where discovery would not result in arrest or interrogation. It would result in silence. The British officers understood the stakes immediately. This was not a simple defection. This was not a suitcase swap. It was a gamble. If they dismissed him, the archive would remain buried, and history would stay incomplete. If they proceeded and failed, the consequences would be fatal for the man sitting across from them. Mitrokhin did not argue for urgency. He did not pressure them. He did not plead. He said only that he had waited many years already, and that he could wait a little longer. At that moment, no one involved yet understood what the archive would ultimately reveal. They did not know how many names it contained, how many lives it would disrupt decades later, how many assumptions it would overturn. They only knew that an unremarkable man had walked into an embassy with a claim too dangerous to ignore, and that once such a claim was heard, it could not be unheard. Vasili Mitrokhin did not grow up dreaming of espionage. He was born in 1922 in a provincial Russian city far from centers of power. His family belonged to the ordinary Soviet working class. No political influence, no privileged connections, no protection beyond anonymity. They lived in communal housing, sharing kitchens and bathrooms with other families. Privacy was limited. Silence was learned early. By the time Mitrokhin reached adolescence, the Soviet Union was already a country where people understood one rule clearly: you survived by being unremarkable. During the years of Stalin's purges, disappearance was normal. Neighbors vanished overnight. Apartments were suddenly empty. No explanations were given. No questions were asked. Children learned to lower their voices. Adults learned to keep opinions unspoken. Mitrokhin learned something more lasting. Information was dangerous, not because it was powerful in itself, but because possession alone could destroy lives.
When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Mitrokhin was 19 years old. Like millions of others, he was mobilized into the Red Army. He did not become a war hero. He was not decorated for frontline bravery. He served in rear units, handling logistics and administration. Paperwork, again. He saw enough of the war to understand devastation, enough to understand loss, enough to understand that survival often depended less on courage than on obedience and discipline. When the war ended, the Soviet Union emerged victorious but ruined. Cities were damaged, resources were scarce. But opportunity existed for those who had served without incident. Mitrokhin found work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Clerical tasks, routine assignments, nothing that drew attention. He proved reliable. In the Soviet system, reliability mattered more than brilliance. Someone who followed instructions and avoided mistakes was more valuable than someone who questioned orders. In 1948, he was recruited into Soviet foreign intelligence, not as a case officer, not as a recruiter, not as an analyst shaping strategy, as support, file handling, records management, administrative coordination. It was the backbone of any intelligence service. And it was invisible. For the next 2 decades, Mitrokhin served abroad in Soviet intelligence stations across Eastern Europe and Asia. The details of these postings remain vague, and that vagueness itself is revealing. He was not the kind of officer whose career generated stories. Colleagues later described him with the same words again and again: competent, thorough, unremarkable. He followed procedure. He met deadlines. He caused no problems. He married. He had a daughter. They lived the life of intelligence families posted overseas. Better housing than most Soviet citizens. Access to special stores. A controlled social circle. It was a life that looked comfortable from the outside, but it came with constant awareness of surveillance. Intelligence officers were monitored not only by hostile services, but by their own. Conversations were cautious. Friendships were filtered. Mistakes carried consequences. Mitrokhin adapted perfectly. He did not complain. He did not rebel. He did not attract notice. By the late 1960s, he was approaching 50. In intelligence services, that age often meant transition. Field work was physically demanding. Travel was exhausting. Younger officers replaced older ones. In 1972, he was reassigned. Not dismissed, not demoted. Reassigned. He was moved into archival work within the 1st Chief Directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence.
To most officers, this was a quiet endpoint, a place where careers slowed down. To Mitrokhin, it became something else entirely. The KGB was in the process of relocating its archives from central Moscow to a new facility in the southwest suburbs. Decades of files had to be cataloged, transported, reorganized. This was a massive bureaucratic operation, and bureaucratic operations needed people like Mitrokhin. He was placed in charge of overseeing parts of the transfer. It was a sign of trust. The archives contained the institutional memory of Soviet intelligence, operations stretching back to the 1920s, networks built and dismantled, agents recruited, compromised, lost. For the first time in his career, Mitrokhin was not just touching fragments of information, he was seeing the whole structure. Day after day, file after file, he read about operations whose consequences had never been publicly acknowledged. He saw how intelligence was used not only to gather information, but to suppress dissent, to manipulate foreign politics, to destroy individuals quietly. This did not produce a sudden crisis of conscience. There was no dramatic moment, no instant rejection of the system. It was slower. Accumulation. He read about the crushing of reform movements, about surveillance of citizens, about operations designed to discredit people who posed no real threat beyond independent thought. Each file on its own could be rationalized. Together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Mitrokhin did not rage against it. He did not speak out. He did not defect. He did something far more dangerous. He decided to remember, knowing that once memory replaced silence, there would be no safe way back. At first, this decision was internal. He began paying closer attention. He noticed details, connections. Then, quietly, he began writing. Not copies, not documents. Notes. Small enough to conceal, brief enough to survive inspection. He did not yet know how far this would go. He did not yet know how long it would last. He only knew one thing. If these records remained locked inside the system forever, no one would ever understand what had actually been done in the name of secrecy. And the most effective way to preserve them was not through theft, it was through memory. The archive was never meant to be a place of danger. In the internal culture of Soviet intelligence, danger existed at the edges, in foreign cities, in covert meetings, in border crossings and surveillance routes. The archive was supposed to be safe. It was where operations ended, where paperwork replaced risk, where history was frozen into folders and shelves. When the KGB decided to move its foreign intelligence archives from central Moscow to a new facility in the southwestern suburbs, the decision was driven by logistics, not paranoia. The old headquarters had run out of space. The files had multiplied beyond what the building could contain. Decades of operations had produced mountains of paper. The new complex at Yasenevo was designed to solve that problem. It was modern, purpose-built, segmented. Access points were controlled. Corridors were monitored. Reading rooms followed strict procedures. On paper, it was secure. The archive held the institutional memory of the Soviet state's most secret activities, files dating back to the early years of the security services, from the Cheka to the OGPU to the NKVD and finally to the KGB. Every era had left its own residue. There were agent recruitment files, assessments written in dry, bureaucratic language that decided whether a person was trustworthy enough to betray their own country, notes about vulnerabilities, ideology, money problems, personal weaknesses. There were operational reports, descriptions of meetings, dead drops, communication methods. There were files on active measures, operations designed not to collect information but to influence events, to spread false narratives, to weaken adversaries without firing a single shot. And there were failures, networks exposed, agents arrested, operations quietly abandoned and never discussed again. This was not the archive of heroes and villains. It was the archive of process. Mitrokhin's assignment placed him inside this system at exactly the wrong moment. He was responsible for overseeing parts of the transfer. That meant access, not unlimited but broad. He could request files. He could examine them for cataloging. He could compare older records with newer ones to ensure continuity. Security protocols assumed a simple truth. The enemy was outside. The KGB trained obsessively to detect foreign penetration, double agents, listening devices, surveillance from hostile services. What it did not fully account for was an insider who did not need to steal documents, someone who only needed to read them. Mitrokhin's workdays followed a predictable rhythm. He arrived in the morning, passed through identification checks, entered controlled areas. Files were signed out, reviewed, returned. Everything was logged. From the outside, his behavior never changed. He did not request unusual materials. He did not linger where he should not. He did not violate procedure. He did something much more subtle. He paid attention. While other officers skimmed, he read carefully. While others focused on relevance to current operations, he absorbed context. Years of administrative work had trained him to see patterns others ignored.
Names reappeared. Methods repeated. Failures followed familiar paths. The archive revealed something that field officers rarely saw. Espionage was not romantic. It was repetitive, predictable, often cruel in small bureaucratic ways. One file described the recruitment of a Western official. Another described how that same person was later discarded when their usefulness ended. One file recorded a successful operation. Another quietly documented the destruction of the people involved. Mitrokhin did not react emotionally. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He kept reading. Inside the archive, this emotional restraint became his greatest protection. The decision to begin copying did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. It formed slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, he simply memorized details, dates, code names, locations. Then he began writing brief notes, not full sentences, not explanations, fragments, a code name, a year, a country, small enough to fit on scraps of paper that could be folded until they were almost invisible. The method was simple, but it required discipline. He could not write too much. Too many notes would draw attention. Too much detail would slow him down. He learned to compress information, to strip it to its essentials. A line that meant nothing to anyone else could reconstruct an entire operation later. The security system worked exactly as designed. Officers were searched when leaving. Bags were inspected. Pockets were checked. But searches were procedural, not forensic. No one removed shoes. No one dismantled clothing. Mitrokhin adapted. He hid notes under insoles, inside jacket linings, in places that were uncomfortable but survivable. Each day he carried out fragments of the KGB's memory on his body. At home, the second phase began. His apartment was unremarkable, a standard Soviet unit, thin walls, unreliable heating. Phones were assumed to be monitored. Visitors were avoided. Late at night, after his family slept, he sat at the kitchen table. He unfolded the scraps. Then he wrote. He expanded each fragment into fuller descriptions while his memory was fresh. He wrote carefully, methodically. This was not impulsive. It was archival work, carried out with the same discipline the system itself demanded. He numbered notebooks. He created indexes. He cross-referenced entries, countries, operations, time periods. He treated his secret work with the same precision he applied to his official duties. On some nights he worked for an hour, on others much longer. There were no celebrations, no sense of progress, only accumulation. Day after day, year after year. The risk was absolute. Discovery would not have meant dismissal or disgrace. It would have meant execution. The KGB did not forgive internal betrayal, especially not betrayal involving archives.
Yet for 12 years nothing happened. No suspicion, no investigation. The system protected itself against the wrong threat. Mitrokhin's invisibility was his shield. He was not ambitious. He did not seek promotion. He did not gossip. He did not complain. He blended perfectly into the machinery. By the time the archive transfer was completed in the mid-1980s, Mitrokhin had filled dozens of notebooks. His access gradually diminished. His copying slowed. Then it stopped. The work phase was over. What remained was a question he had delayed for years: what to do with what he had preserved. He did not destroy the notes. He did not share them. Instead, he hid them. At his dacha outside Moscow, he created concealment spaces beneath floorboards, inside walls, in the garden. He distributed the material so that discovery in one place would not erase everything. This was not optimism. It was caution. The archive he had built was no longer active intelligence. It was potential history. And history, in the Soviet system, was dangerous. By the time Mitrokhin retired, the Soviet Union itself was beginning to fracture. But the archive remained buried, waiting. There were no close calls dramatic enough to remember. No alarms triggered, no interrogations, no sudden changes in routine. Every day looked like the day before, and that sameness was what made discovery most dangerous. Mitrokhin continued going to work at the KGB archives. He continued performing his duties with the same quiet competence. He continued attending meetings, signing forms, following procedures. And every day the same pattern repeated: read, remember, write a little, hide it, go home. The system never noticed him, because the system had no reason to. The KGB was built to detect enemies who acted differently, who moved too fast, who asked the wrong questions, who tried to bypass procedure. Mitrokhin never did any of that. He obeyed rules so precisely that he became invisible inside them.
At the end of each workday, security checks were routine. Officers knew the rhythm of inspections and behaved accordingly. No one lingered. No one protested. Mitrokhin passed through the same checkpoints thousands of times. Each time, fragments of the archive were hidden on his body, small pieces of paper, folded until they were barely there, placed where discomfort replaced suspicion. He learned which hiding places were safest, which ones attracted attention, which ones survived random searches. This was not courage in the traditional sense. It was discipline. At home, the danger changed shape. The KGB did not need to catch him at work. They only needed to notice something unusual in his personal life. Too much writing, too much secrecy, too many patterns. Soviet apartments were not private spaces. Walls were thin. Phones were assumed to be monitored. Neighbors observed each other without being asked. Mitrokhin adjusted. He wrote late at night, when his wife and daughter slept, when the building was quiet. He never spoke about his work, not even in vague terms, not even as complaint. He did not keep the notebooks in his apartment for long. Finished notebooks were moved out of the city, to the dacha. The dacha was both refuge and risk. It was where Soviet families escaped urban life, where vegetables were grown, where weekends were spent. But it was also a place of informal surveillance. Neighbors noticed unusual behavior. Changes were observed. Mitrokhin worked carefully. He lifted floorboards only when necessary. He replaced them precisely. He created hiding places that left no visible trace. The notes were wrapped, protected against moisture, distributed. He never stored everything in one place. This was not paranoia. It was experience. He understood how investigations worked, how searches were conducted, what signs triggered deeper scrutiny. During these years, the psychological pressure never lifted. There was no finish line, no clear moment when the danger would end. Every day required the same restraint. At work, he could not show interest. At home, he could not show anxiety. With colleagues, he had to remain ordinary. There were moments when the temptation to stop must have been strong. 12 years is a long time to maintain silence, a long time to carry knowledge that could destroy you instantly. But Mitrokhin did not rush, because haste inside a surveillance state was indistinguishable from confession. He believed that haste would be fatal. The archive was growing, but it was incomplete. Stopping early would mean gaps that could never be filled. So he continued. Year after year, the Soviet system itself began to change. Leadership shifted, rhetoric softened slightly, reforms were discussed.
But the archives told a different story. Past operations did not disappear because politics changed. The consequences of those operations remained. People recruited decades earlier still lived their lives believing their secrets were buried forever. Some had died. Some had built families. Some had reinvented themselves. Their names were still there, waiting in files, waiting in notebooks. Mitrokhin understood something that few inside the system ever acknowledged. Time did not erase intelligence work. It only delayed its consequences. By the early 1980s, his access began to narrow. The archive transfer was completed. His role changed. Files passed through his hands less frequently. He noticed the shift immediately. This was the system closing its window. By 1984, the copying had effectively ended, not because he chose to stop, but because the opportunity had closed. The notebooks were complete enough. From that moment forward, the archive existed only in hiding. He continued working until retirement in 1988, a quiet ceremony, a pension, no suspicion. Outwardly, his career ended as it had unfolded, without incident. Inwardly, the risk had not diminished. Retirement did not mean safety. Former KGB officers remained under observation. Random searches still occurred. Investigations still reopened old files. The archive was no longer growing, but it was still alive. Every knock on the door carried weight. Every rumor of inspection mattered. The Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Policies changed. Borders shifted. Power weakened. For Mitrokhin, this did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. A collapsing system could be more dangerous than a stable one. Old rules dissolved. New authorities competed. Security services fragmented but did not vanish. Possession of classified material could be interpreted in unpredictable ways. The archive he had preserved for 12 years now demanded a decision.
It could not remain buried forever, but revealing it too early could mean death. Revealing it too late could mean irrelevance. For the first time, time itself became his enemy. The silence that had protected him was beginning to close in. By the time the Soviet Union began to collapse, Mitrokhin had already lived with his secret for more than 15 years. The archive was no longer growing, but it was no longer dormant either. The late 1980s brought changes that no intelligence officer of his generation had been trained to handle. Reforms were announced, taboos weakened, criticism appeared in newspapers. For some, this felt like liberation. For others, it felt like danger without rules. The security services were reorganized, renamed, divided. But surveillance did not disappear. It became less predictable. Mitrokhin understood the system too well to mistake chaos for safety. A stable authoritarian state punished consistently. A collapsing one punished arbitrarily. By 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolving in real time. Republics declared independence. Central authority fractured. For someone in possession of classified material, this was not a moment of relief. It was a narrowing window. If the archive remained hidden, it could be discovered during a random inspection. If it was destroyed, 12 years of risk would become meaningless. If it was revealed improperly, the consequences would be fatal.
Mitrokhin began to think seriously about contact. His first instinct was practical. If the archive was to matter, it had to reach a place where it could be analyzed safely and preserved permanently. Inside Russia, that was impossible. The question was no longer whether to leave, but how to do so without ensuring his own disappearance. In late 1991 or early 1992, he attempted contact with American officials. The exact details remain unclear. Accounts differ. What is clear is the result. Nothing happened. Whether due to skepticism, bureaucratic failure, or simple misunderstanding, the attempt led nowhere. For Mitrokhin, this was not merely a rejection, it was a warning. Western intelligence services were flooded with false claims at that moment. Walk-ins were treated cautiously. Extraordinary stories were filtered out quickly. If he failed again, he might never get another chance. He adjusted his approach. Instead of trying to convince from Moscow, he chose distance. He traveled to Latvia. Riga was no longer firmly under Russian control. Foreign embassies there were less monitored. The political environment was unstable, but less tightly watched. In March 1992, he entered the British embassy. This time, he brought proof. Not the archive itself, but enough fragments to demonstrate credibility. What followed was not a rescue, it was interrogation. For weeks, Mitrokhin was questioned repeatedly, not aggressively, methodically. British officers tested his knowledge. They challenged his claims. They searched for contradictions. They assumed deception until proven otherwise. Mitrokhin did not resist this process. He expected it. He answered questions about KGB structure, about archival procedures, about operations that British intelligence partially understood. Each answer aligned. Each clarification reduced doubt. But still, everything hinged on one thing, the archive itself. Without it, Mitrokhin was only a source. With it, he was something else entirely. The decision was made quietly. If the archive existed, it had to be recovered, and the only person who could retrieve it was the man who had hidden it. That meant sending him back. Not immediately, not recklessly, under a cover that would not attract attention. The plan was simple in theory and terrifying in reality.
Mitrokhin would return to Russia as a retired man tending to personal affairs. He would go to his dacha. He would recover the notebooks. He would do so slowly, at night, without witnesses. Then, once the material was secured, extraction would follow. The margin for error was zero. A neighbor noticing unusual activity, a security service revisiting old records, a single careless movement. Any of these would end everything. Mitrokhin agreed, not because he underestimated the danger, but because delay now carried its own risk. During the summer of 1992, he returned. Night after night he worked. Floorboards were lifted carefully and replaced. Walls were opened and resealed. Buried containers were recovered and the ground restored. He worked alone. No witnesses, no assistance. The archive emerged piece by piece, not as a dramatic reveal, but as accumulation. Stacks of notebooks, thousands of handwritten pages. They filled cases. By the time he finished, the physical weight of what he had carried in secret for decades became real. What followed was disappearance. By autumn, Mitrokhin and the archive were gone. Not announced, not acknowledged. Only later would analysts understand what had arrived. At that moment, it was simply an unprecedented volume of memory. And once memory leaves a closed system, it cannot be put back. For the people named in the archive, history did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as a knock on the door. They had lived ordinary lives for decades, careers built, families raised, mistakes buried under time. They believed the Cold War was over. They believed their secrets had survived it. They were wrong. When British intelligence completed its initial verification, the scope of what Mitrokhin had brought became impossible to minimize.
This was not a collection of rumors. It was not a narrative shaped by memory alone. It was structure. Names linked to code names linked to handlers linked to operations. Patterns emerged that counterintelligence services had suspected but never proven. For American authorities, the archive reopened files that had been cold for 30 years. One of those files belonged to Robert Lipka. Lipka had worked at the National Security Agency in the mid-1960s, not as an analyst, not as a strategist, as a clerk. He handled documents. He moved paper.
It was precisely the kind of position that attracted little scrutiny. According to the archive, Soviet intelligence identified him early. They assessed his vulnerabilities. They approached him quietly. He agreed. For several years, he removed classified materials from his workplace. He photographed them. He passed the information to his handlers. Then he stopped. He went to college. He built a new life. No suspicion followed him. For decades, he lived believing that whatever he had done had disappeared into the vastness of Cold War bureaucracy. In the mid-1990s, that illusion ended. Federal agents came to his home. They did not accuse immediately. They asked questions. As the interview continued, details emerged that Lipka had never shared with anyone. Meetings, payments, methods. Confronted with specifics drawn from the archive, denial became impossible. Lipka pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to prison. The punishment did not match the time that had passed, but it matched the reality that time does not erase classified acts. Lipka was punished late. Hall was never punished at all.
Another name in the archive carried even heavier historical weight. Theodore Hall had been a physicist at Los Alamos during the Second World War. He was young, brilliant, ideologically motivated. He volunteered information to Soviet intelligence while working on the atomic bomb. For decades, investigators suspected him. Signals intelligence hinted at his role, but proof was never sufficient. The archive confirmed everything. Hall had provided detailed information about nuclear weapon design. He did so, believing that preventing an American monopoly on atomic weapons would serve humanity. By the time this confirmation emerged, Hall was an old man living quietly in Britain. He was never prosecuted, not because the evidence was weak, but because time had reshaped the question: what did justice mean 50 years later? In Britain, the archive exposed a different kind of case. Melita Norwood had lived an unremarkable life in suburban London. She worked in a research organization connected to atomic materials. For nearly 40 years, she passed information to Soviet intelligence. She was never suspected, never investigated, never questioned, until the archive named her. When authorities interviewed her in her late 80s, she did not deny her actions. She did not apologize. She explained them. She believed she had acted for ideological reasons. She believed she had helped create balance. The British government chose not to prosecute, turning the question of guilt into a question of time. The decision not to prosecute Melita Norwood became the most visible example.
To some, it was cowardice. To others, it was pragmatism. Critics argued that justice delayed was still justice denied, that successful deception should not be rewarded by age. Supporters argued that the Cold War had ended, that ideological conflict had dissolved, that punishment would serve only revenge. The debate revealed something deeper. Intelligence services are built to operate in secrecy. Legal systems are built to operate in public. The archive forced these two worlds to collide. Prosecuting every case would expose sources and methods. Not prosecuting would invite accusations of selective justice. There was no neutral ground, only choices that carried consequences in different directions. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies made compromises. Some information was shared with allies. Some was withheld. Some cases were pursued quietly. Others were deemed too sensitive to touch. What mattered most was not punishment. It was prevention. The archive became a teaching tool. Recruitment patterns were analyzed. Vulnerabilities were mapped. Failures were studied. What Soviet intelligence had done successfully for decades could now be understood in detail, and understanding was power of a different kind. For the individuals exposed, the reckoning was uneven. Some expressed remorse. Some defended their actions. Some said nothing at all. The archive did not offer closure. It offered memory, and memory does not care about comfort. It does not ask whether the timing is fair. It does not adjust itself to moral convenience. It simply exists. By the late 1990s, the public learned fragments of what intelligence agencies had known privately. Books were published. Journalists investigated. Debates resurfaced. Russia denied everything. Officials called the archive a fabrication, propaganda, a Western attempt to rewrite history.
But internally, Russian intelligence conducted its own investigations. They found failures they could not ignore. An archivist had copied files for 12 years without detection, not through brilliance, through patience. For intelligence professionals worldwide, the lesson was brutal. The greatest threat is not always the dramatic traitor. It is the quiet insider who understands the system better than anyone else. The archive forced a final realization. Cold Wars do not end cleanly. They end in paperwork, and paperwork has a long memory.
When the work was finished, there was no moment of celebration. No announcement, no ceremony, no recognition. The archive did not end the Cold War. It arrived after it. Its power was not in stopping events, but in explaining them. For intelligence agencies, the Mitrokhin material became a reference that could not be replaced, not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed how everything fit together. It showed how recruitment actually worked, not as theory, but as routine. Ideology, money, personal weakness. The same patterns appeared again and again. The archive showed that espionage was rarely driven by grand strategy alone. It was driven by opportunity. People were not recruited because they were powerful. They were recruited because they were reachable. Clerks, technicians, researchers, positions that seemed minor until placed inside a system that valued fragments. For historians, the archive changed the tone of Cold War history. It replaced speculation with documentation. It filled gaps that had lasted for decades. Operations once attributed to coincidence were revealed as deliberate. Suspicions dismissed as paranoia were confirmed as accurate. The Cold War did not look cleaner. It looked messier, more human, more compromised.
For families, the impact was the hardest to measure. Children learned truths they had never imagined. Spouses reevaluated entire marriages. Identities built over lifetimes fractured quietly. There were no apologies that could restore the past, no explanations that felt complete. History had arrived too late to be fair, but too clearly to be ignored. For Russia, the archive became an uncomfortable mirror. Official denial gave way to quiet acknowledgement that a catastrophic internal failure had occurred, not because a brilliant enemy had penetrated the system, but because the system trusted its own routines too much. What failed was not loyalty, but the assumption that routine could replace vigilance. The archive forced reforms, stricter controls, reduced access, more suspicion. But suspicion had its cost. Intelligence services that fear their own people eventually lose what they are trying to protect. For the man at the center of it all, there was no public legacy. Vasili Mitrokhin lived the rest of his life in Britain under an assumed identity. He worked quietly with analysts and historians, explaining terminology, clarifying structure, correcting interpretation. Those who met him did not describe a triumphant figure. They described someone careful, serious, often distant. He had not escaped the weight of what he had done. He carried it. He had betrayed an organization he once served faithfully. He had exposed people who believed they would never be found. He had altered lives without ever meeting most of those affected. He never claimed moral clarity. He believed only that the record should exist. When he died in 2004, there were no public obituaries, no memorials, no official acknowledgement. He was buried under a name that was not his own. The archive lived on without him. Books were written, research continued, cases were re-examined, and slowly, the meaning of what he had done became clearer. The most powerful intelligence operation of the Cold War was not a spy ring, it was a filing system, and the most dangerous act was not stealing secrets, it was preserving them. The Mitrokhin archive did not ask whether exposing the past was kind, it asked whether forgetting it was acceptable. In the end, that question has no final answer, only consequences, and that is why the most dangerous secret is not the one that is stolen, but the one that survives.